Good morning, friends. It's Saturday. I'm back with Chapter 3 of Campaign at Fort Stix. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the mists of time with a story I call First Recon. All that remained to finish Fort Stix was to find a slab of wood or other suitable material to make the door. Moving the bucket outside next to the door opening, I sat with a small piece of flat wood and my crayon looking at the farm around me. The first thing I noticed was that other than flower beds down the hill in front of my great aunt's house, there was nothing planted here. Weren't farms supposed to have crops and animals? My thoughts were interrupted by annoying sounds to my left, and I looked up to see my brother standing there breathing. "What you doing?" he asked, looking at the board. "I'm making a map of the farm," I said, and began to draw vague shapes to represent what I was seeing. "Why do you need a map?" "'Cause I need to find a door for the fort." "Why do we need a door?" he pressed. I began to get frustrated by his tirade of questions and stopped drawing to explain. "Well, first, how are we going to keep people out if we don't have a door?" He shrugged his shoulders and looked around as if to see what people I was talking about. "And second, we can't have secret meetings in the fort if we don't have a door to keep them secret." "Oh," he said half-heartedly. I returned to drawing my map. Looking around the field, I was intrigued by the numerous old car parts and other assorted scrap, but what caught my eye was the small shed built into the backside of the garage. It looked like another outhouse, but there was no opening in the door to let light in, and there was a stovepipe on the roof. I jumped up from the bucket quickly, causing my brother to take several involuntary steps back, and headed for the new shed. The weeds at this far back corner of the garage were very high, over my head in some places. I had to fight through them to get to the shed, stopping periodically to look up at the garage to keep my bearings. After several minutes, I stood before the mysterious shed, looking through the already open door into darkness. Moving slowly closer, my eyes began to adjust, and I saw several large steel hooks hanging from the old rafters, and metal racks like the ones in our oven sticking out from the walls. At the bottom was a large barrel where something had been burned, and I knew all at once I was looking at a smokehouse. "What are those big hooks for?" Mark asked as he pushed into the door opening next to me. "That's where they used to hang the bodies of the people they caught sneaking around and getting into other people's business." I said this as a joke, knowing it was where large pieces of meat were hung to be smoked. But of course, Mark was only 6, and he took this seriously. "Really?" he asked, his eyes getting wide. "Yeah, sure," I said and reached toward him. "Here, let me show you how they work." Mark screamed as he scrambled away backwards and ran back toward the house, yelling for Mom. I could still hear him yelling inside the house as I poked around in the fire barrel with a stick. Finding nothing else of interest, I closed the door and began to make my way behind the garage. Coming to the corner on the house side, I saw the placement of the buildings created a natural walkway from the back porch to this corner. A few feet toward the woods from the back of the garage, a small incline led down into a small flat clearing behind the garage that went right to the edge of the woods. Beside me, a small tree with clusters of white flowers formed a natural boundary between the yard and pathway. I would later learn this was an elderberry tree, and my grandfather liked to use these berries to make elderberry wine. From behind the far corner of the garage where it started, the clearing continued to my left all the way to the wood line which ran beside the house on the far side. Where the woods formed a corner was a tree there, with long sagging branches that reached all the way to the ground. This, I later learned, was a weeping willow. I both loved and hated this tree. Why did I hate the tree? You ever hear of a willow switch? Have you ever been sent out to get a switch? No fun. Curious, I went to it and stood under the canopy looking up. Since it was early in the spring, it only had small leaves, but I had the idea that once it fully bloomed, It might make a great place to hang out where I could see what was going on around me, but others could not see in. I took a moment to make notes about the tree and smokehouse on my map, and when I looked up, I saw a light shining through the trees to my right and down the hill. That must be where my grandfather lived. Daylight was quickly fading, and I had not yet found the door for Fort Stix. I started to move a little quicker and headed between the house and wood line toward the front where we had first come in. Other than a few large leafy plants growing at the edge of the trees and the sounds of crickets and frogs, there was nothing worth noting on my map until I rounded the far corner of the house and stood beside an enormous tree. The tree was so large I could not reach side to side on one side of it, and it took a long minute to walk all the way around it. I looked over at Fort Stix and back to the tree, realizing that this tree was bigger than my fort. Looking up, I saw it had broad, smooth leaves, and it was also higher than the house. Imagine if I could hollow it out and make a fort inside that tree. The limbs of the tree looked big enough to walk on, but unfortunately, the nearest limb was almost as high as the roof of the house. Across the lawn from the big tree was a smaller tree with branches I could easily reach. Though it was much smaller, it had a lot of branches and looked as though it might be a pretty easy climb. I set my map on the front porch and walked around the smaller tree, studying it as I planned my first climb. Yeah, I was sure I could make it to the top with no problems. I reached for the nearest branch to pull myself up when a voice came from behind me. "Boy, don't you even think about climbing up in that tree," a raspy female voice said to me. I turned to see who it was and recognized my great aunt. In one hand she carried a picnic basket with a towel draped over the contents, and in the other a cigarette she smoked between words. "Why not?" I asked. "It looks strong enough." "That tree is a Bartlett pear tree that your grandma and I planted together after your grandfather was killed in the war in Normandy." She came closer and reached out to touch the tree as if it were a dear old friend. "Your grandpa promised your grandma that when the war was over, he was going to plant a pear orchard out there in that field. When he didn't get to come back home, your grandma and I planted this tree to remember him by." She was pointing out to the field where my fort now stood and seemed to be looking a long ways off. I wondered what she was thinking about. Her eyes shifted suddenly back to the tree and she pointed to a few small buds on the branches. "Those buds are very delicate, and if you go climbing this tree, they'll fall off and there'll be no pears come fall." She took a long, deep drag from the cigarette and then crushed it under her heel as she turned toward the house. "There are plenty of trees in the woods for you to climb, so stay out of that one." She wagged her finger at me with each word. I watched as she pulled the screen door open and disappeared inside the house. Reaching out to touch the pear tree, I found it was not only smooth, but it felt warm. It was starting to get dark, and I realized I had not been into the new house since we arrived this morning. I also had not eaten anything all day and wondered what might be in that picnic basket. I turned to follow my great aunt on inside the house. As the screen door was closing, something from the corner of my eye caught my attention, and I looked back at the pear tree. Several lightning bugs were circling the trunk, blinking on and off. I decided right then that the pear tree was special, and I would respect my great aunt's wishes. Making a circle on my map, I labeled it Grandma's Pear Tree and put an exclamation mark next to it. I never got to meet my real grandma or grandpa on my dad's side of the family. As my great aunt said, Grandpa died in Normandy during World War II. I have a picture of the newspaper article about his fall and the big homecoming parade for him and 2 other local soldiers. The first thing I noticed after stepping into the house was the smell. It reminded me of the musty old root cellar in the basement corner at my other grandmother's house. It wasn't a bad smell, but it smelled old. I was standing in what looked like it had once been a porch that was enclosed to make it part of the house. The room was as wide as the front of the house and about 8 feet deep. On the left side was a swivel barber chair with an old-fashioned hairdryer, a sink cabinet with barber tools laying on the counter and some cardboard boxes. I learned later that my great-aunt and my grandmother used to run a beauty parlor here, and in later years my great-uncle worked as a barber giving shaves and haircuts. On the right side were some more cardboard boxes piled on an old sofa and an overstuffed chair. Across from them stood a small cabinet with an antique record player. It looked just like the one I used to see in the old commercials with the horn sticking up over it and the big round needle head. Next to this was a large box full of old records. I was curious and took one of the records out to look at it. It was very old. The record was the Beer Barrel Polka, and it said 78 RPM. My small records were 45 RPM, and the bigger ones were 33 RPM. I'd never seen a 78 RPM before this, and knew it had to be valuable. I carefully put it back in the box, and after making a mental note to check these out in the future, walked through the doorway into the front room where I heard voices. The front room had a doorway leading off to the right, which I found to be a bedroom with large brass bed and a couple of dressers. There was a couch and a couple of chairs along the walls of the front room, and the far end of the room was a wall with a doorway leading further in. Through the next doorway, I stepped into a much larger square room. Next to the doorway on the right stood a large black potbelly stove with its stovepipe going up into the ceiling. Just past this was a door into another bedroom. The far wall had a doorway on the right side leading into the kitchen, and in the left corner was a built-in pantry. Going closer to the pantry, I felt like I was looking at a mad scientist's laboratory. There were many mason jars filled with liquid and canned foods. Among them were pickled eggs, pickled pig's feet, potatoes, chunks of what looked to be red meat, and several jars of pears. On the bottom shelf, about waist high, were several small trays like what doctors use in operating rooms. On the trays were vials of medicine and glass syringes. "Your great-uncle Rudy was a diabetic and had to give himself insulin shots," my great-aunt said from behind. "That's what the needles and medicine are for. Don't worry, I'll take care of that stuff before you move in. Come on to the dining room. I brought over some food for dinner." After she grabbed a jar of peaches, I followed her through the doorway into the kitchen, noticing, but not yet exploring, the door to the basement on my left. As she went to the sink, she pointed to a door to the right. "Go into the dining room. I'll be right there." In the dining room was a long table with chairs all around it. My mom, dad, and little brother were all sitting at the far end away from the door eating. The picnic basket sat in the middle of the table, and it had been unpacked to reveal several plates and bowls of food. Both outside walls were mostly windows, and I could see the sun settling down behind the trees. The outhouse cast a long shadow toward the house, as if to call to me. The room had a distinctly old Western feel to it, with hardwood panels and trim boards on every wall. There was even sawdust on the floor. "Sit down there," my aunt said as she came into the room and pointed to a chair next to my brother. I sat where she told me to and watched as she made me a plate and poured me a glass of milk from a mason jar. The food looked awesome, although, except for the fat stuffed cabbages, I did not know what most of it was. I watched as she piled a little from each dish onto 2 plates and handed me one. "Thank you," I said, taking my plate, and she smiled. After digging into the stuffed cabbage, I cut a piece from a flat fried patty. Inside it was cream-colored, and I was not sure what it was. But I've never been a fussy eater, so I ate it. It was one of the best things I ever had. Eager to see what else was on the plate, I cut into each thing and was surprised to find fried meatballs, Polish sausage, and fried potatoes. Each dish had been pan-fried and was covered in spices and breadcrumbs, making them hard to identify. I cleaned my plate pretty quickly and looked to see if there was any more of the flat patties. "What are the flat patties?" I asked my aunt. "Fried patty pan squash," she said, smiling. "I call them patty cakes. Do you like them?" "I love them," I said enthusiastically. "Can I have some more, please?" Smiling, she put a couple more on my plate and I finished them quickly, finishing by drinking my milk. Looking up, I saw everyone else was done eating as well. My parents and aunt had opened fresh beers and were sitting smoking as they talked while my little brother sat dozing in his chair. I heard a stomping at the back door on the porch, and then the back door opened. "Anyone home?" I heard my grandfather ask. My dad went out to greet him and helped him carry a case of beer in, setting it on the table. The sun had gone down while we were eating, and there was now a chill in the air. I watched as Dad and Grandpa talked for a minute, and then both of them left the room. I saw them come back in a few minutes later, carrying a bucket and some logs past the dining room door and into the bigger room in the middle of the house. Curious, I got up and followed to see what was going on. The steel door to the old potbelly stove was open, and they were busy putting small pieces of paper and wood inside. After a few minutes, they lit the paper, but when it burned up, the wood had failed to catch. "Seems like the wood's a little wet from the melt-off," my grandfather said as he brought a chair back from the dining room and sat near the stove. "We might have to get some lighter fluid or a torch to get it started." My father held up his finger and turned to disappear into the room near the stove. He came out a few minutes later carrying a full bottle of whiskey. "I found this hidden in some papers by the bed when I was looking around earlier," he said, handing the bottle to my grandpa. Grandpa reached into his pants pocket and pulled out his knife. There was a corkscrew on it, and he used it to pull the cork from the bottle. He tipped it back, getting a good drink, and handed it to my father. "Yeah," Grandpa said, blowing out forcefully. "That'll get that fire going." My dad took a good drink from the bottle and then poured some of the whiskey onto the wood in the stove. He went and got himself a chair from the dining room along with a can of beer for each of them, giving the whiskey time to soak into the wood. He set the chair next to Grandpa's, and after handing him a beer, set his own on the chair and went to the stove. Reaching in with his cigarette lighter, he struck the flint under the wood pile. A sudden woof sounded, and flames shot out of the stove in a brief flash, causing him to jump back, laughing in surprise. My mother and great aunt come rushing out of the dining room to see what happened, followed by Mark, who rubbed his eyes sleepily. "What happened?" my aunt asked, concerned. Grinning, Grandpa held up the whiskey bottle, saying, "Just needed a little kick to get the fire going." She grabbed the bottle from him and looked at it. Pulling the cork with her teeth, she tipped the bottle back and took a long drink. "Yeah, that's the stuff," she said. "Rudy and I used to have a little of this every now and then, rest his soul." She tipped the bottle back and took another drink before handing the bottle back to Grandpa, who drank and honored Uncle Rudy as well before handing the bottle to my dad. By this time, the fire was burning strong, and they closed the steel door to keep the smoke inside. Grandpa adjusted the flue before going into the dining room to get a couple more chairs for my mom and great aunt. They moved the beer into the same room with them and settled in to reminisce for a bit. Before long, my mother got up and took Mark into the room by the stove and put him to bed. She came back out for a moment to say goodnight and tell me to go lay down in the other room before she went back in and closed the door. It was Saturday night, and despite the fact that we were on the farm, I was not in the least bit ready to go to sleep. I took my mother's chair next to my dad and moved it a little ways back, closer to the stove, where I could soak up the warmth. It had been a very interesting day so far, and I was not about to give it up until I absolutely had to. I listened closely to my dad, Grandpa, and great aunt talk for several hours until the beer was gone. Finishing her beer, my great aunt got up from her chair and headed toward the front door with her picnic basket hanging from her arm. "I slaughtered 2 chickens today for dinner tomorrow," she said, supporting herself on the doorframe. "I'm making roast chicken with stuffing, and it will be ready at 2 o'clock, so I'll see you then." After she left, my dad went to the fridge and brought back the last 2 beers from those he had brought with him. As they cracked the cans, my grandpa looked over at me. "Aren't you tired yet?" he asked, taking a shot from the whiskey bottle. "No, sir," I said quietly, surprised I had been noticed. He handed me the whiskey bottle, saying, "Here, have a little of this. It'll help you sleep." I took a small drink from the bottle and breathed fire after I caught my breath. I could feel the fire all the way down to my belly and started getting warm all over. After I caught my breath, I realized he was laughing as I handed the bottle back. That reminds me of this boy I saw down at the river in Liverpool by the bridge one day many years ago. He got up and threw a couple of chunks of coal in the stove and closed the door. I went down there to catch me some fish for supper and found this boy, I'd say about 10 or 11 years old, sitting on the bank fishing. He paused to get a drink. I asked if he was doing any good, and he showed me a nice stringer of fish, but then commented the fishing would be better if these dang worms wouldn't bite him every time he tried to bait his hook. He laughed a bit and wiped a tear from his eye. I looked in his coffee can to see what kind of biting worms he had, and there was a bunch of tiny little copperhead snakes in there. He and my father began rolling with laughter, though I didn't understand why at first. To me, this was horrific because copperhead snakes were poisonous. Everyone knew that. That boy was dumb as a box of rocks, my grandpa said between laughs, but he sure could catch fish. As they quieted down, I realized I was finally tired. I said goodnight, gave Grandpa a hug, and wandered off to climb into the big brass bed in the other bedroom. As I lay there about to fall asleep, I realized I'd heard a lot of family history tonight, and some things had been sorted out for me. My father was not one to talk about family to my mom or us boys. I really cannot remember him ever telling me anything about any of his family, and as a result, I really did not get to know any of them. I never knew my real grandfather, his dad, since he had died in Normandy during the war. At some point after that, my grandma remarried again to my grandpa, and then she passed away when Dad was only 5 years old. I also knew my dad had a sister and 2 brothers. On this night, I discovered that my grandma and my great aunt were actually twin sisters, and great uncle Rudy was their brother. The war was hard on my grandma, and she had asked my grandpa for a divorce before realizing she was pregnant with my dad. When she got the word Grandpa was killed in the war, she began drinking heavily and eventually died from cirrhosis. I have often wondered if Grandma drank herself to death because she felt she was responsible for Grandpa's death, or if there was some other reason. Either way, I knew it hurt my grandpa deeply, as he had said as much this night while I was listening. I also learned that my dad's sister was current Grandpa's daughter, but Dad's 2 brothers were from current Grandpa and Grandma. No blood relation, but still family. If I learned nothing else that night, I learned that family can be confusing. I drifted off to sleep thinking about my next work on Fort Stix and my bike. I still had more than a full week of spring break to enjoy them both. I hope you enjoyed this look into campaign at Fort Stix. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next week with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.